The night I found Robin Williams sitting alone in the dark corner of that small San Francisco comedy club, I had no idea that the next 2 hours would quietly rearrange everything I believed about joy, pain, and what it means to truly show up for another human being. I had gone there because my doctor had just told me that the constant tightness in my chest was probably stress, but that my heart was not getting any younger. And when you're in your 60s and someone says, "Oh, il bur comme el kara," you hear something much heavier than what the words technically mean. You hear a countdown you didn't know had already started. I remember gripping the steering wheel in the parking lot, staring at my trembling hands, wondering how my life had shrunk into a series of appointments, pill organizers, and polite conversations with people who looked past me, as if age had turned me into background furniture. When I walked into the club, I just wanted to disappear into the dark and let someone else talk for a while. But as my eyes adjusted to the dim light and that old red brick wall behind the stage came into focus, I noticed a shape in the corner booth to the left, shoulders slightly hunched, head tilted down, fingers absent-mindedly rolling a napkin into a tight little rope. It took me a full 15 seconds to believe what I was seeing. It was Robin Williams, without the movie lighting, without the manic whirlwind of characters. Just a man in a worn-out jacket, the lines around his eyes deeper than the last time I'd seen him on screen, staring down at an untouched glass of water, as if he couldn't quite decide whether to pick it up or walk away from it forever. No one else seemed to notice him yet. The room was half full, people scrolling through their phones, waiting for some local comic whose name had been written crookedly on the chalkboard outside. And I stood there in the doorway, frozen, whispering his name under my breath like some kind of prayer I didn't remember learning. Robin Williams, is that really you? I took a seat a few tables away because I didn't want to be that person, the one who rushes over and demands a photo, proof for the internet that they'd once been close enough to touch a legend. But my heart was thudding so loudly that I could feel each beat echo in my ribs, and all I could think was, what is he doing here, alone, in a place this small, on a random Tuesday night? The host went on stage and did a few clumsy jokes that fell flat, then announced there would be a very special surprise drop-in guest, and I watched Robin's shoulders lift with a long, slow breath, like a diver filling his lungs before plunging into cold, uncertain water. He stood up, smoothed the front of his jacket with that nervous efficiency I recognized from 100 interviews, and walked toward the stage with a slight limp I'd never noticed before. As if each step carried the weight of 1,000 expectations no one had asked if he could still bear. When he took the microphone, the room finally realized who he was, and a wave of gasps and applause crashed into him. For a moment his eyes lit up with that familiar spark, the one that says, "It's okay, I've got you. Let's laugh together so life doesn't swallow us whole." He started with quick, sharp jokes, bouncing between voices, making fun of his age, of technology, of how the world had become a place where people laughed more at glowing screens than at each other's faces. I laughed with everyone else, but I was watching more than I was listening. Watching the way his eyes sometimes drifted upward between punchlines, as if checking some invisible clock only he could see. And then something shifted. A couple in the front row started whispering to each other, looking at their phones instead of at him. And it was such a small thing, such a normal, modern disrespect that most performers would have brushed it off. But for some reason I saw the way his jaw tightened, just for a second, the way his fingers squeezed the microphone a little too hard, knuckles whitening under the stage lights. It was such an ordinary moment, but the part that still follows me into the quietest hours of the night is what he did next. He didn't snap, he didn't call them out harshly, he didn't turn the room against them. Instead, he lowered his voice, almost to a whisper, and said, "You ever notice how sometimes the loudest kind of loneliness is when you're surrounded by people who aren't really with you?" The room fell silent so fast it felt like the air pressure changed, and I could feel something inside my chest crack open, because suddenly it wasn't a comedy set anymore. It was a confession delivered through a joke-shaped key. He went on, weaving little stories into the stand-up, memories about making movies, being the funny guy on set even when he felt like a shadow dragging itself from trailer to trailer, trying not to show how tired it was. He joked about doctors and checkups, and the way they say, "for your age," like a curse wrapped in politeness. And my mind flashed back to my own doctor's office, that same casual terror disguised as reassurance. And just when I thought the night had settled into this bittersweet rhythm of laughter and quiet truth, he said something that snapped every nerve in my body awake. "You know, The strange thing is, people always believe the easiest version of you. They believe the smile. They believe the improvisation. They believe the clown. But they almost never ask what you had to bury to keep that performance going. It was as if someone had turned a spotlight inward and pointed it straight at the parts of my heart I'd been ignoring for decades, the regrets I'd packed into the attic of my mind and told myself I was too old to unpack now. After the show, the host thanked him and the room erupted in applause, people standing up, shouting his name, some with tears in their eyes, and I watched him bow with that familiar, humble tilt of the head. But as the lights dimmed and the crowd started to move toward the bar or the exit, I saw something that almost no one else was looking for. Robin stepping off the stage, shoulders rolling forward again, the light in his eyes softening back into something closer to exhaustion than triumph. I don't know what possessed me. Maybe the echo of his words about people not really seeing you. Maybe my own fear of going back to my quiet, half-lived existence. But my legs moved before my doubts could catch up. And suddenly I was standing a couple of feet away from him as he sat back down in the corner booth, wrapping both hands around that same glass of water he still hadn't tasted. "Mr. Williams," I heard myself say, my voice shaking more than I wanted it to. I just wanted to say, thank you, for tonight, and for, honestly, for my childhood, I guess. He looked up at me, and I swear to you, in that second there was no performer, no character, no famous man who'd lived 1,000 lives on screen. There was just a tired, kind-eyed human being who had never quite learned how to accept gratitude without flinching a little. He smiled, small but real, and said, "Ah, thank you, my friend. Childhood is a team sport. You know, takes a lot of people to get us through it." I laughed, but my eyes were burning, and before I could stop myself, I blurted out, "Do you ever get tired of always having to be the one who makes everyone else feel better?" For a heartbeat I thought I'd gone too far, that I'd crossed some invisible line and he'd brush me off with a joke. But instead, he looked past me, toward the stage he'd just left, and said softly, "More than you'd think, less than you'd fear. And sometimes I wish someone would just sit down and let me be boring for a while." The honesty of it hit me so hard that my next breath felt like swallowing glass. I slid into the booth across from him when he gestured for me to sit, and we started talking the way strangers sometimes do, when they both sense that something fragile and important is hovering between them. He asked my name, what I did, and I told him I was retired. That vague word people use when they don't want to admit that their days feel like chapters ripped out of a book and scattered on the floor. He teased me gently about it, saying, "Retired? No, you're just between plot twists." And I remember thinking how easily he could turn a tired cliché into something that felt like a small, hopeful prophecy. But the truth was, I didn't feel between plot twists. I felt like the story had quietly ended, and no one had bothered to tell me. The more I listened to him, though, the more I realized that even he, with all his fame and success and beloved roles, was wrestling with his own fear that the world had written the last chapter for him without asking his opinion. And here's the part that still makes my hands shake when I think about it. He kept glancing at a folded, worn piece of paper on the table beside his glass, as if it were a living thing that could either comfort him or bite him, depending on when he chose to touch it. At one point, my eyes lingered on it a second too long, and he noticed. He gave me a lopsided smile and said, "You ever have something you carry around for years, and you're not sure if it's a reminder or a punishment?" I swallowed and said, "My whole body feels like that some days." He chuckled, but there was sorrow caught in the edges of the sound. He tapped the folded paper and said, "Old letter from an old friend, or an old almost friend. Depends on the day you ask me. We had a falling out a long time ago. Said some things, didn't say others. I keep thinking I'll throw it away, but then I worry that if I do, I'll lose the last chance to fix something that maybe was never meant to be fixed in the first place." It struck me then that even someone like Robin Williams, whose life seemed so full from the outside, still walked around with the same kind of unfinished sentences in his heart that I did, the same unanswered questions, the same quiet what-ifs that kept him awake in hotel rooms after the laughter had faded. And if that could be true for him, what did that say about all the invisible burdens the rest of us carried while pretending everything was fine? We drifted into talking about age, how people treated us differently now, how being called Sir or Mr. too often made you feel like you'd been gently moved to the edges of the photograph of life. He told me about a young producer who had once insisted very politely, that the studio needed a fresher face for a project he'd wanted to do, someone less associated with the past, and he'd nodded and smiled and made a joke to break the tension. But inside, he said, it felt like they were putting me in a museum while I was still breathing. As he said that, I thought of all the times my kids had looked at me with that same kind of polite distance, as if I were an old TV show they respected but didn't bother to watch anymore. And here's where everything really began to turn inside out for me. He suddenly went quiet, staring at the condensation on his glass, and then murmured, "They see you as a season they already been. They don't expect new episodes from you. They certainly don't expect you to surprise them." My throat tightened, because that was exactly how I'd been feeling about myself, like life had moved on to the next series, and I was left behind on some forgotten channel at the end of the dial. I don't know what pushed me, but I heard myself say, "Do you ever feel like you're the one who stopped expecting anything new from yourself?" The question hung there between us, heavier than the tired neon buzzing above the bar. He looked at me in a way that made me feel completely seen and absolutely naked, and then he nodded slowly. "Every day," he said. "But the trick is to keep lying to yourself just enough to get out of bed. You tell yourself, today might still surprise you, and some days it does." He leaned in then, lowering his voice as if sharing a secret with a fellow conspirator. "I'll tell you something I don't usually say out loud," he whispered. "I come to little places like this because they don't expect the legend. They just expect a guy trying to make people forget their own pain for a few minutes, and sometimes that makes it easier for me to forget mine." Something about the way he said that soft, almost apologetic, made me realize just how much we all depended on the roles others assigned us, even when those roles became cages. I thought about my role in my family, the reliable father, the stable husband, the quiet grandfather, and how somewhere along the way, I'd stopped asking myself who I was when no one needed me to play those parts. I told him all of this, babbling more than I meant to, and instead of pulling back, he listened like it mattered, like each word was a small, delicate object I was handing him. When I said I feared dying without having done anything that truly belonged to me, he shook his head and said, "You underestimate the size of the invisible things, the moments no one claps for, the nights you sat with a sick child, the times you didn't say the cruel thing even though you wanted to, the apology you never got but decided to forgive anyway. That's the real film no one sees, and I promise you, it's the one that counts." We were both quiet after that, two men separated by fame and history but united, somehow, by the weary tenderness of knowing time was stealing pieces of us when we weren't looking. The noise of the club swelled and dipped around us, but the booth felt like its own little island. I noticed his hand trembled slightly as he reached for the glass at last, taking a small sip of water, as if to test whether his body still remembered how to accept something simple. "You know what scares me?" he said suddenly, startling me with the sharpness in his tone. "It's not the thought of dying, it's the thought of leaving behind a version of myself people think they understand. When the truth is so much messier and gentler than that. They remember the wild energy, the noise, the manic joy. They don't see the quiet mornings when I sit at the window and wonder if I've actually helped anyone, or if I've just distracted them from themselves for a little while." I shook my head, feeling a pressure in my chest that had nothing to do with my heart condition. "You helped me," I said, my voice raw. "You helped me survive middle school, and my parents' divorce, and nights when I thought I would never laugh again. You were there even when you had no idea I existed." His eyes glistened then, and he laughed softly, the sound trembling at the edges. "Isn't that something?" he whispered. "We go through life not knowing where we land. Maybe that's the only kind of immortality we get, the pieces of ourselves that go on living in other people's memories." He checked his watch and sighed. "I've got to head out soon," he murmured. "Early call tomorrow. They still want me to dance a little, you know." He said it with affection and a hint of fatigue. I panicked for a second at the thought that this moment, this fragile, impossible conversation was about to dissolve into the ordinary march of time. "Before you go," I said, "can I ask you one selfish question?" He nodded. "If you were mid-60s, scared of your own body, feeling like your story already ended, what would you do tomorrow morning that you haven't done in years?" He leaned back, thinking, his eyes searching some distant place only he could see. Then he smiled, and it was the truest smile I saw from him all night. "I'd disappoint someone," he said. I blinked, confused. He chuckled at my expression. "I'd disappoint someone who expects you to stay small, to stay predictable, to stay quiet." I'd call one of those people who thinks they have you filed away in a drawer labeled done, and I'd tell them no, I'm not available. No, I don't agree. No, I won't keep pretending I don't have anything left to say. And then, he continued, tapping the worn letter on the table, I'd finally read the thing I've been too afraid to open, and I'd write back, even if it's just to say, I'm sorry I waited this long to tell you how much you mattered. We sat there in the hum of the club's fading energy, and I realized his health, his age, his invisible battles were all part of a ticking clock he understood far better than I did. And yet he was still choosing, every day, to step onto some kind of stage and offer whatever light he had left. As he stood up to leave, he placed a hand briefly on my shoulder, and in that touch there was something like a benediction, not from a celebrity to a fan, but from one tired soul to another. Hey, he said, tomorrow might still surprise you. Let it. Then he slipped the letter into his pocket, instead of leaving it on the table, as if our conversation had nudged him 1 inch closer to forgiveness with her, for someone else, or for himself. I couldn't be sure. I watched him walk out into the night, the door closing behind him with a soft thud that felt far too final for such a simple sound. When I finally stepped back outside, the air was cool and smelled faintly of rain. I sat in my car for a long time, listening to the droplets begin to drum on the windshield, thinking about the way his eyes had looked, not like the eyes of a man who had everything, but like the eyes of someone who had given so much of himself away that he sometimes forgot there was anything left for him. I thought about my own life, all the times I'd chosen silence over truth, comfort over courage, resignation over curiosity. In that cramped parking lot, with the streetlights flickering and the wipers squeaking uncertainly across the glass, I made a small, quiet promise to myself. I would call my daughter in the morning and really listen instead of just waiting for my turn to talk. I would dust off the old notebook in my nightstand and finally write the story I'd been carrying around in my chest since I was 20. I would talk to my doctor not as if he were the judge of my remaining worth, but as if he were a partner in whatever time I had left. Most of all, I would stop treating my life as if the credits had already rolled, because if a man like Robin Williams, who had every reason to believe his legacy was already carved into the world, could still drag himself onto a tiny stage in a half-empty club on a Tuesday night and dare to offer something new, some fragile mix of laughter and truth, then who was I to decide I was finished? As I turned the key in the ignition and pulled out onto the wet, glistening street, I realized that the tightness in my chest hadn't vanished, but it had changed. It no longer felt like a fist squeezing my heart, but more like a hand trying to knock from the inside, asking to be let out, asking me to pay attention. I don't know what the rest of my story will look like, how many pages are left, or whether anyone else will ever read them, but I know this: somewhere out there, a man who spent his life making strangers feel less alone, sat with me in a dark corner of a small club and reminded me, without preaching or posing, that the quiet, unfinished parts of us are where the real miracles hide. And as I drove home through the rain, I found myself whispering into the darkness, not as a fan, not as a child of his movies, but as one aging soul to another. Thank you, Robin. Wherever you are tonight, I hope you've finally found a room where you're allowed to be boring, and loved, and completely, beautifully unfinished.